We are studying from the book of Obadiah. When's the last time you heard a message on the book of Obadiah? I don't know that I can ever recall hearing a message on the book of Obadiah except just a couple hours ago at Carp Lake. But Obadiah has a message for us today, just like any other book in the Bible. Obadiah is a book in the Old Testament. It's the only book in the Old Testament that only has one chapter. It's also unique in that Obadiah is one of only maybe two books, for that matter, that deal almost exclusively with another nation other than with God's people. And we're going to look at, I'm going to call it the Tale of Two Mountains, or we could call it the Tale of Two Twins who reside in two different mountains. And I want to begin with just an account in the 70s, I believe it was. There was a study in the University of Minnesota, and it's still ongoing, I believe, but it was the study of twins reared apart. And you probably heard of some of these twins. The most famous of them are referred to as the Jim twins. They were given up for adoption, see there, and they were given up for adoption in like a few weeks or something like that old. They had never met each other, that there was another twin to them. As it ended up, they only lived about 40 or 45 miles apart from each other. And they came together for this study. They got in touch with one another at the age of 39, and they found out some very fascinating things about each other. First of all, they both looked quite a bit alike, but not only that, they were both named Jim, James or Jim, and they both had beloved childhood dogs named Toy. When they had similar experiences in high school, they both married women by the name of Linda, and then they both had trouble in those marriages and ended up divorcing their wife Linda, and they both remarried women named Betty, and then they both had sons, and they named their son James Allen. But the difference came in. One spelled Allen with one L, and another spelled Allen with two L's. Now, there were some other differences, but they were strikingly similar. And it was fascinating to these researchers to study. Now, there is another set of twins that are not as well known as the Jim twins, Jack and Oskar Yuffie. They were born in Port of Spain, Trinidad, on January 6th, 1933. Now, they lived there in Trinidad for about 6 months, and then their parents split up. And Oskar went back to Germany with his mother, and Jack stayed with his father and grew up in Trinidad. Now, in Germany, in the 30s and in the 40s, Oskar did what almost all young people did. He joined the Hitler Youth Movement. Every morning when he went to school, he greeted the principal and teachers with the greeting, Heil Hitler. Now, Jack, back in Trinidad, was being raised Jewish by his Jewish father. And of World War II and all of that from a distance. Obviously, he was separated from its son, being in the Caribbean, and it wasn't really real into him until he went to stay with his father's sister, his aunt, who had gone to live in Argentina. She was the only one of his father's family who had lived in Europe that survived. And she told of her experiences of living through Dachau. And right about that time, the nation of Israel was joining, and she encouraged Jack to immigrate to Israel, and he did, and joined for a short period of time the Israeli army. A set of identical twins. Oskar, growing up in the Hitler Youth movement, sworn to secrecy that his father was Jewish, and Jack eventually moving to Israel and joining the Israeli army. Didn't work out in Israel. He didn't really, he wanted to go on. His father had come to the United States. And so at the age of 21, Jack went to the United States. But on the way to the United States, he stopped in Germany and met Oskar for the first time. They didn't really speak the same language, and so it was a very awkward visit, but something fascinated them, or maybe bewildered them would be the better word to say. As they met each other, they were wearing identical clothes. I forgot, we have twins right here, don't we? I forgot, we have twins right here, don't we? You're not wearing identical clothes, though, are you? And they became, 25 years later, part of the Minnesota study of twins reared apart. Similarities were found, but their upbringing was vastly different. From the Hitler Youth to the Jewish young boy. And while they found those similarities, there were stark differences, and they said that they had a love-hate relationship. They were both repelled and attracted to one another. They were what some people call twin enemies. And the book of Obadiah is the sad commentary, the sad conclusion of a sibling that had devolved into twinemies. What is the message from Obadiah for us today? Let's turn to Obadiah. Obadiah, verse 1. The vision, thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent from among the nations, saying, Arise, and let us rise up against her for battle. Behold, I make you small among the nations. You shall be greatly despised. So here we find that Obadiah comes with a message to Edom. Who is Edom? Where is Edom? Here's a map of the time period of when it was a kingdom. And you notice here that Edom is south and to the east of the kingdom of Judah. It's a very rocky, mountainous, and primarily desert environment. Now, Edom today is in the country, although there's more than Edom, to this country than just where Edom was, and as we look at this book of Obadiah, we see that God is directing a message of judgment to Edom. Now, who is Edom? Edom were the inhabitants of, or the descendants of Esau. And Esau had a twin brother, Jacob and Esau. And unfortunately, as we look throughout the Bible, Jacob and Esau were more like twinemies than anything else as we look at it. But notice the reason why judgment is coming upon Edom. Notice verse 3. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high. You who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Verse 4, though you ascend as high as the eagle, and though you set your nest among the stars, From there I will bring you down, says the Lord. Notice here's a first reason why Edom is being judged. What is the reason that it gives for the judgment upon Edom? We see it says, the pride of your heart has deceived you. And so here they were proud. Now, it also seems that they had a very secure fortress of where they were dwelling. Notice he says, you make your habitation high, though you ascend as high as the eagle and you nest among the stars, I will. Edom was proud. But there's even a greater reason why Edom is judged here in the book of Obadiah. Go to verse 10. For violence against, what does it say? Your brother Jacob. Shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. For violence against your brother Jacob. The primary reason in the book of Obadiah that Edom is judged is because of violence against their brother. Now, when we think about that, Jacob had been born a long time ago. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,500 years previously. Certainly over 1,000 years, but probably much longer than that. We don't know exactly when when the book of Obadiah was written. I believe it makes the most sense from the other biblical connections that it was probably shortly after the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. But there are other ideas. But that's what I believe makes the most sense. 1,500 years ago, Jacob and Esau had lived thereabouts. Now, what had their experience been? It's very interesting. Isaac prays for his wife, Rebekah. And Rebekah conceives. And she comes and something is wrong, and she prays to the Lord because she says, what is going on here? In Genesis 25:22, it actually uses very interesting description. Just read it here quickly. Genesis 25:22 says, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Rebekah had these twin boys. Now, these twin boys don't seem like they're identical twins from the descriptions of them, but they're twins nonetheless. And here are Jacob and Esau. And when do they begin fighting? Before they're born, they begin fighting. The first thing we know, even before we know their names, are that Jacob and Esau are at odds with one another, way, shape, or form. Now, the next thing, after they're born, when they're born, Jacob grabs Esau's heel. They continue fighting even as they're born. They begin to grow up. Esau goes out for a hunt, as he loves to do, and he comes back with no food, and he is famished. And Jacob has some very aromatic soup that's on the pot there on the fire, and Esau says, oh, my brother, can I have some of your soup? And Jacob says, will you give me your birthright? Was that a very brotherly thing to do? He drove a hard bargain, didn't he? He didn't say, sure, you're out, you're exhausted, you've been hunting, let me give you some of my soup. No, he sees an opportunity to take advantage of his brother, and he says, give me your birthright. And Esau says, I'm about ready to die. My birthright won't do me any good. It's yours. Just give me that soup. He was prioritizing temporal, earthly things above spiritual, heavenly things. It always gets us in trouble. But they're both wrong there, aren't they? Because Jacob never should have been trying to swindle his brother out of his birthright. The next story that we have is Rebekah hearing your father is going to bless Esau. Esau's a hairy man, so go take some goat skins and put it on yourself. I'll make some sin and get the blessing instead of your brother. And Jacob says, I'll be cursed because my father will curse me instead of bless me when he finds out it's me instead of Esau. And she says, just go ahead, I'll take care of it. Jacob goes in and steals the blessing from his brother. Now, we know from the prophecy beforehand that Jacob was going to receive that blessing. But it's always better to wait on the Lord's way instead of trying to force the Lord to do it your way. And so he goes in. And then, next account, what does Esau think of that? Esau is livid. He is furious, the Bible says, and he's looking for an opportunity to kill his brother. Edom followed Esau as a continual adversary of Israel. And it even takes, Esau begins to come, 20 years after that, Jacob is coming back from Syria, and as he comes back, it's a miracle of God to avoid Esau avenging himself. Now, was Esau wronged there? He had been cheated of his birthright. He voluntarily relinquished it, but it was still a cheating that went on there. He had been taken advantage of, and Esau was not happy. Now, it does seem like there was some reconciliation between Esau and Jacob, but all it says is that they buried their father together. But then when we look throughout the Bible, we see continual adversity. Go back to the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 20. This is the next time we see the Edomites, really. Numbers chapter 20. And here the children of Israel, you remember on the map that Edom was to the east, Edom was to the east and to the south of the promised land. And they were hoping to be able to go through the land of Edom to make it much shorter and much more convenient to get to the promised land. And so they sent a message to the king of Edom. We see the message in Numbers chapter 20, verse 14. Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardship that has befallen us. And he continues from there. And then he says, please, let us, verse 17, let us pass through your country. We won't go to your fields. We won't eat your vineyards. We won't even drink water from your wells. We'll just go on that highway and stick to ourselves. We won't hurt you at all. Was that a conciliatory message? Sure. Your brother Israel is saying this. We endured this hardship. Now all we want is to pass through your land. And what was the response? Verse 21 of Numbers 20. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage as territory. So Israel turned away from him. Israel had to take the long route through the Arabian desert, more or less. There's another Edomite that we find in the Bible. David is fleeing from Saul, and he stops by the tabernacle. They give him some of the showbread, and somebody sees David. Doeg, the Edomite. And Saul finds out about it. Doeg tells Saul, and Saul gives the command to slay all of the priests. And the Israelites refuse to do it, but Doeg takes up the sword and slays the priests of Israel. The Edomites were the continual adversary of Israel. Notice Psalm 137. Psalm 137, verse 7. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. What are the sons of Edom saying to Jerusalem? Knock it down, destroy it clean, don't leave any. Take a razor to it, raze it to the ground. But even faced with this continual adversarial relationship, God gave a message to the children of Israel. What was that message that he gave to Moses? Look, we're going to go back to Obadiah, but let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse says here, Deuteronomy 23, 7, this is Moses' directions to the children of Israel. Edom has just refused them passage through their land. They have refused to give them any of their water or their food. They have refused hospitality. And notice what the directions were to the children of Israel. Deuteronomy 23, 7, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. What was the Israelites' relationship to be? They were not to abhor them. They were brothers. Turn back to Obadiah. Thousand years thereabouts passes by from when God directed Moses that. But from the book of Obadiah, we can see that Edom has not changed. They felt that they did not need to help their brother, and maybe one of the reasons that they felt that they did not need to help their brother was because of the security of the location that they had found. Edom was a rocky place with mountainous that only if you knew how to get there and to navigate it would you be able to survive. In fact, there's a very famous site. It's considered by some to be one of the 7 wonders of the world, that is right where Edom was. Now, this is not a site that was built by the Edomites, but it was inhabited by the Edomites. A very, very narrow canyon that you have to pass through for about 3/4 of a mile. And when you get to the end of that canyon, you see Petra, the stone city, carved out of stone. Now, it was probably the Arabian nomadic people that came in after Edom was destroyed, according to the fulfillment of Obadiah, and built this city. But this was Edom's territory. These mammoth stone fortresses, as it were. But Edom never learned to love their brother. Notice verse 10. Start in verse 10 of Obadiah. Notice what it says. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. In the day that you stood on the other side, in the day that strangers carried captive his forces, when foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, even you were as one of them. What does it say they were doing here? thoughts for Jerusalem, and one of them, notice in the first part it says, in the day that you stood on the other side. What is the picture there? Jerusalem is being invaded. Jerusalem needs help. And what is Edom doing? Watching. They're doing nothing. They did nothing when Israel was in need. Notice verse 12. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of distress. What's the picture now? It says you should not have rejoiced over the children of Judah. What is Edom doing? The Babylonians come against Jerusalem, it seems, and they stand by and they do nothing. And not only that, but they rejoice. Is it brotherly love to rejoice when calamity falls on somebody else? What if they deserve it? Well, serves them right. That's what Edom was doing. Serves them right. They deserve what has come to them. No, that is the very reason that Edom was condemned. What about if somebody has done you wrong? Somebody has injured you. If somebody's done you wrong and injured you, had Jacob done Esau wrong? But did that make it right for Esau to hold a grudge? No. Being condemned here for holding 1,000+ year grudge. Not only did you not help when your brother needed it, but you rejoiced. You were happy in a sort of way when calamity fell upon them. It's a verse in the New Testament, and it's in the context of Esau. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. And it says, lest there be any root of bitterness in you, springing up, by which many are defiled. Esau and Esau's descendants, Edom, held on to that root of bitterness. They had been legitimately wronged. But they held on to that root of bitterness, onto that grudge, and it poisoned their life, and it poisoned the life of their descendants. And 1,000 years later, God, through his prophet Obadiah, declares judgment has come upon you. It doesn't matter the mountain fortresses that you have. It doesn't matter how high up you can go. Judgment has come upon you because you have not manifested brotherly love to your brother. You have allowed a grudge, a root of bitterness to spring up and defile you. You know, have you ever gone into your flower bed or to your garden and pulled weeds? How easy is it to get all of the roots out? Okay, better to let a goat in there. It's a lot easier, isn't it, if you can take care of the goat at least. It's hard to get those roots out, isn't it? And it's almost impossible to get every fiber of the root out. When we have been wronged, it is impossible of ourselves to get the fibers of the roots of bitterness out. It's impossible. It requires a miracle from God. But Edom did not experience that miracle from God. For violence against your brother, you're cut off. You stood by on the other side. Maybe you didn't do anything bad to them. Of course, later on they do. But maybe at that time you didn't do anything bad to them, but you didn't help them. Now, when we've been wronged, it's one thing to not do wrong for wrong, right? It's one thing to say, no, I'm not going to, two wrongs don't make a right. But it's an entirely different matter to say, now I'm going to go help the very ones that have wronged me. But that's the standard that God is calling Edom to and that they failed to come to. And that standard that they failed to come to was, yes, they wronged you. Yes, they wronged your ancestors. Yes, all of that is true. But you still need to assist them when they're in need and not rejoice over them when things go wrong in their lives. Notice verse 13. You should not have entered the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. What does he do? Notice it repeats, in the day of their calamity. They took advantage of their brother Israel in the time of their calamity. Then verse 14. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those among whom nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in. Esau was condemned for his lack of brotherly love. If Esau and Edom were condemned for their lack of brotherly love, for holding on to a grudge, refusing to the roots of bitterness out, how is it with us? Could we fall in the same pitfall that Edom did? What does God say to us today? It doesn't matter if somebody's wronged us or not. We have an obligation to show them brotherly love. And who is our brother? Everyone. Especially those that have hurt us. In this context here. Obadiah gives a message that judgment comes when we do not demonstrate brotherly love for one another. Now I have a bunch of verses from the New Testament of how we demonstrate our love for one another. But we don't have time to look at all those. God calls us not to stand by when our brother is in need. Not to rejoice when ill happens to another human being. Not to take advantage of a brother or sister or anyone when they are disadvantaged. God calls us here through the message to Edom. They might not have known a lot of the truth that Israel knew, but they knew that they should manifest brotherly love towards Israel, and they didn't. 1 John chapter 3, verse 16 says we ought to be laying down our lives for the brethren. That's a high calling. A church historian records, he did not know the Apostle John, but he knew those that knew the Apostle John. And it was recorded that as the aged Apostle John would come into the congregation, he would say, "Little children, love one another." And after they became annoyed with that or whatever, they would say, "Why do you always keep saying this?" And the aged Apostle John would say, "It is the Lord's command. If this alone be done, it is enough." True love demonstrated in our lives is what God is calling to. It says later on in John, he says, if you don't love your brother that you can see, how can you love God whom you cannot see? And so Obadiah is a book of judgment, a judgment upon Edom for their lack of brotherly love. And Obadiah is a book that calls us to manifest true love, brotherly love, for one another. By the way, there seems to be one exception to the Edomites that were enemies of Israel. And we don't know for sure if this was an Edomite, but there was a man by the name Obed-Edom. Obed-Edom means servant of Edom. Obadiah means servant of Yahweh, servant of the Lord. But Obed-Edom means servant of Edom. A man by the name of Obed-Edom covenant for several months after Uzzah touched it and died, and until they brought it into Jerusalem. If Obed-Edom had some connection to Edom, which it seems like he must have because of his name, Obed-Edom reveals that Edomites can learn to love their brothers as well. And I believe the last part of Obadiah tells us that. We see that, I said the tale of two twins or the tale of two mountains. Notice verse 17. And on Mount Zion, now we have the mount, another mount. And on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. Then notice verse 21. Then saviors shall come to Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Edom, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Those that learn to leave the mountains of Edom with their unbrotherly love for one another and learn the brotherly love of Mount Zion will be in the kingdom of the Lord together. God calls us to Mount Zion. He calls us to leave behind the mountains of Edom. God calls us to a deeper, greater love for those in need. And as we think about that love, that deeper, greater love that God calls, that Obadiah, this message to the Edomites who were eventually destroyed and uprooted, and we know of no nation of Edom or even Edomites in existence today because of brotherly love. God was calling them. Learn to love your brother. And he calls us to learn to love our brother today. Not to hold a grudge against them, to learn to love and to allow God to uproot every root of bitterness from our lives. I want to have that experience. Do you want to have that experience? It's a miracle of divine grace that only God can do. but he can turn us from Edomites into Israelites. And that's the experience I want.